The next demand curve shifter we're going to explore is a change in the income level of consumers. Okay, and so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the demand for products in two separate markets. Okay, and let's say this is the market for steak, and say this is the market for hamburger meat. Okay, so that's the demand for hamburger meat. So if income levels rise for some reason, okay, so for instance, the economy's growing, unemployment is falling, people are getting pay raises, they're doing better than they were yesterday. Okay, what would happen to the demand for steak at any price level of steak? Well, people would probably start consuming more steak. Okay, you would see an increase in the demand for steak. At the same time, probably see a decrease in the demand for hamburgers, because when people were less wealthy, they weren't purchasing the luxury sort of steak-like product. They were probably purchasing more hamburgers and eating more homemade tacos and more homemade hamburgers and things like that. Why? Because hamburgers probably, you know, typical price of hamburger, say, is $3.99 a pound. Okay, but a typical price for steak was probably $6.99 a pound. So pound for pound, steak was a more luxurious item when people weren't as well off. But now people are better off, and so they start purchasing more steak and purchasing less hamburger. So the demand for hamburger then would fall. So incomes rise, the demand for steak rises, the demand for hamburger falls. Very simple. On the flip side, what if we go into a recession and people become less wealthy, they start losing their jobs, etc.? Well, we would see them do the opposite. We would see them buy less steak at $6.99 a pound, and they would probably increase their consumption of hamburger because it only costs $3.99 a pound. Okay, obviously two completely different dynamics, even though the change in the income level was the same. Incomes rise, the demand for steak rises, but the demand for hamburger meat falls. Incomes fall, the demand for steak falls, but the demand for hamburger meat rises. Let's look at two other cases. Let's say this is market demand for new cars, and probably satisfies the law of demand. And let's say this is market demand for used cars. Okay, and that's the demand curve for used cars. Say the typical new car costs $25,000. Okay, and let's say the typical used car only costs $5,000. Okay, so that P prime on used cars is $5,000. Let's go over exactly the same changes in income. So when people become wealthier, assume that the federal government lowers your income tax rate, and they do it across the board for everyone. So now everyone has more take-home pay. Well, then they can afford a larger monthly payment. What is likely then to happen to the demand for new cars? Well, it's probably going to rise. People have more take-home pay. They can, when they were on the margin of being able to afford a new and used car, those people can now afford a new car. So you'd see an increase in the demand for new cars. At the same time, you'd probably see a decrease in the demand for used cars, and vice versa. If for instance income tax rates rose and people were less wealthy, you would probably see a fall in the demand for new cars and an increase in the demand for used cars. We call stakes in new cars normal goods. And a normal good, strictly defined, is simply a good whereby there is a positive relationship between the change in the income level and the demand for the product. Let me repeat that. A normal good is defined as a product where there is a positive relationship between the demand for the product and or a change in the demand for a product and the change in the consumer's income level. So consumers' income levels rise, demand rises. Incomes fall, demand falls. We call hamburger and used cars inferior goods. And that is simply, these are goods defined as a negative relationship between changes in income levels and changes in the demand for the good. Let me repeat that. An inferior good is defined as a negative relationship between changes in income levels and changes in the demand for the goods. In other words, incomes rise, demand falls for these products. Income levels fall, demand rises for these products.